her ein Posten liegt. Was hat es, das ist so hoch versteckt, mein Herz? Was hat es, das ist so hoch versteckt, mein Herz, mein Herz? Die Post bringt keinen Brief für dich, was längst du denn so wunderlich, mein Herz, mein Herz. Die Post bringt keinen Brief für dich, mein Herz, mein Herz. Was längst du denn so wunderlich, mein Herz, mein Herz. Nun ja, die Post kommt aus der Stadt, wo ich ein liebes Mädchen hab, mein Herz. Wo ich ein liebes Mädchen hab, mein Herz, mein Herz. Wird wohl einmalchen übersehen und fragen, wie es dort vergeht, mein Herz, mein Herz. Will's wohl einmalchen übersehen, mein Herz, und fragen, wie es dort vergeht, mein Herz, mein Herz.
Yeah, and with this musical introduction, a very warm welcome here on the magic mountain of Pacific Palisades in the living room of the Thomas Mann House. This year, we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of Mann's modernist masterpiece, The Magic Mountain, and we have curated a thrilling program for you tonight, a conversation with Samantha Rose Hill and Paul Holdengräber, and we have also a concert, a small concert series with David Kaplan and the students of the UCLA Herb Albert School of Music. My name is Oliver Hartmann, and I'm the director of the Thomas Mann House, and we are a residency center and space for transatlantic debates. For those of you who don't know that, every year we invite up to 15 scholars from Germany. They come here, they are staying at the house. You can see their faces here on the board, and if you look around, maybe you can recognize some of our fellows sitting next to you as well. And yeah, what we do here, we bring together in our fellowships interesting persons, outstanding personalities from Germany, from the United States, and they are discussing pressing topics of the contemporary political system, of the future-related issues in politics, in culture, in society. Every year we have an annual topic. Last year we were discussing the political mandates of the arts, and this year, it's an election year, we are discussing democracy and vulnerability. And we do this, so to say, in the spirit of Thomas Mann, who was during his time in California, he dealt extensively in his essays, writing, and lectures with issues such as the root of fascism, democratic renewal, freedom, migration, and exile. And I think at this point, it's time for me to hand over the mic to Benno Herz, our program director, who will give you some further insights about this night. And thank you so much for coming tonight here, and I wish you a great evening.
Good evening. Welcome from me as well. My name is Benno Herz. And yeah, it's a very special occasion for us tonight to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Magic Mountain in this house, and with such a distinguished group of guests and with such wonderful partner organizations. For those of you who are here for the first time, we are in the former living room of the exile residence of the Mann family, who lived here from 1942 to 1952 after having migrated here, fleeing from Nazi Germany. At this time, the west side of Los Angeles, and more specifically this neighborhood of Pacific Palisades, was teeming with other European emigres and exiles, such as philosophers Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, writers Leon Feuchtwanger, Vicky Baum, and Bertolt Brecht, composers such as Alma Mahler-Werfel, and of course Arnold Schönberg across the canyon from here, just to name a few. These artists, writers, and thinkers would go on to forever change the cultural landscape of the city, and building on that legacy and history of exile, our house today hosts the fellowship programs that Oliver mentions for intellectuals that aims to create a space for transatlantic debate. While preparing this event, I became interested in what Mann was thinking about the Magic Mountain while living here in exile on San Remo Drive, so far away from the mountains of Davos, 20 years after its publication. For context, Mann was born in 1875. He was 37 when the Magic Mountain was first published in 1924. 5 years later, in 1929, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. And in 1933, only a few years later, he was forced into exile and resided in Switzerland. In 1940, Mann and his family moved to Los Angeles, and at that time, the Magic Mountain was already 16 years old, and Mann in his mid-60s. Reading Mann's diaries during his time in Pacific Palisades with a focus on the Magic Mountain shows that Mann was still very much thinking about his novel's reception. On May 11, in 1943, for example, he notes here at his desk in his study, which is actually open tonight if you want to roam around after the event and have a look. He notes, quote, "New reprints of the Magic Mountain, The Beloved Returns, and the transposed heads in France and Italy, probably for the Germans there," end quote. The next time he mentions the Magic Mountain is on September 14 of the same year, quote, wrote a dedication in a copy of The Magic Mountain to Schönberg for his birthday. Send a letter to him, end of quote. This is especially curious given the argument between Mann and Arnold Schönberg that unfolded a few years later after the publication of Dr. Faustus in 1948, which caused quite a friction among the exile community in LA. And maybe we touch upon that later in your conversation. But the majority of the diary entries you will find on the Magic Mountain during Mann's time in Los Angeles are probably the most LA thing you can imagine. Quote, Die Dramatisierung des Zauberbergs. The dramatization of the Magic Mountain, of course, the movie adaptation. Mann sold the film rights to British producer Alexander Korda and was in touch with directors such as the Hungarian transplant to Hollywood, George Tabori, who had completed a treatment for a potential film and even already suggested actors for the film. Greta Garbo as Claudia Chauchat and Montgomery Clift as Hans Castorp. I would have loved to seen that film, actually. According to Tabori, however, a film that took place in a sanatorium among the sick was unthinkable in the Hollywood of the 1940s, and the film was never realized. Later in the 1940s, another director became quite interested in the project and was already in exchange with Mann about the project. No other than William Dieterle, director of The Life of Emile Zola and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. But the film adaptation of The Magic Mountain never materialized during Mann's lifetime. I would like to end my little anecdotal story here on yet another very short anecdote about the music in The Magic Mountain, which will serve as a perfect segue into tonight's program. Tonight we will hear a performance of Prelude to the Afternoon of Fawn by Claude Debussy, one of the favorite pieces of music of Hans Castorp in the novel. And the last time this song most likely reverberated through these walls was on January 6, 1946, when Mann was working on his music novel Dr. Faustus, on this piano actually, with the help of a philosopher by the name of Theodor W. Adorno, who came up here every other day to help Mann understand 12-tone music. And now I'm quoting Mann in my translation. Good meat for lunch. After lunch, I read some of Baudelaire's prose. Tea in the bedroom before I went over to Adorno's with my notebook. Wrote down numerous points to be improved and other suggestions. After dinner, I listened to the music, enchanted by Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. So without further ado, let's welcome our guests and start with the program. I now have the pleasure to introduce David Kaplan, who will tell us more about the two pieces he selected for tonight's short rendition of Mann's historical piano. After the short concert, Samantha Rose Hill and Paul Holdengräber will engage in a conversation, followed by another short musical performance of Schubert. David, wonderful that you're here.
Thank you so much for having me.
David has been called excellent and adventurous by the New York Times and praised by the Boston Globe for his grace and fire at the keyboard.
It's fake news.
He has appeared as a soloist with numerous orchestras, including the Britten Sinfonia and the Symphony Orchestra Berlin. Known for diverse and creative recital programs, he has appeared at prestigious venues such as the Washington National Gallery and Strathmore. David's New Dances of the League of David, mixing Schumann with new works, was cited in the Best Classical Music of 2015 by the New York Times. And David is also assistant professor of music performance at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music. And warm welcome to David. David, before I hand it over to you, I just would like to thank our institutional partners on this event, Patricia Wyatt and the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center, Mark DeLucas and Lauren Wolf at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, who can't be here tonight, and of course the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you all for having me, and I'm delighted to be here. And to work together with the Mann House on a few things over the years. I know my role, it's to play piano, so I'm not going to tell you many words, but it is worth highlighting, why these pieces and how we put this together. There's a nice section of the book where Castorp takes us through some of the pieces that he's listening to on records. And this is by itself interesting because just 50 years earlier, maybe someone of Castorp's, the protagonist's social class, would maybe have played some piano or maybe some other instrument. But maybe Mann is criticizing his characters a little bit, that they're passive consumers only, that they need the record player and they need the encroachment of technology to enjoy music. But nevertheless, Castorp is in some spells listening to music. We're going to hear Mann's favorite piece, one of his favorite pieces, the Debussy. But it's interesting that he chose this piece because in Castorp's time, maybe it was not yet so popular yet. And I'm going to read you a review from a period just before the First World War, where somebody said the following about the Debussy prelude, L'après-midi d'enfant. Poor Debussy, sandwiched in between Brahms and Beethoven, seemed weaker than usual. We cannot feel that all this extreme ecstasy is natural. It seemed forced and hysterical. It is musical absinthe. There are moments when the suffering faun in Debussy's Afternoon of a Faun seems to need a veterinary surgeon. Or another one, that Debussy's prelude was a strong example of modern ugliness. That the faun must have had a terrible afternoon, for the poor beast brayed on muted horns and whinnied on flutes and avoided all traces of soothing melody until the audience began to share his sorrows. The work gives as much dissonance as any of the most modern artworks in music. All these erratic and erotic spasms but indicate that our music is going through a transition state. When will the melodist of the future arrive? So that's what people really thought of Debussy. But so Castorp, it's a bit out of his taste actually, where he normally likes opera arias and sort of more Biedermeier friendly bourgeois stuff on the record player, that he has an attraction for some reason to this amazingly modernist and maybe difficult work. And here's what Castorp, his was the impression on Castorp. He was wont to rest from the terrors and ecstasies in another number, brief, yet with a concentrated power of enchantment. Peaceful compared with the other, an idyll, yet raffiné, shaped and turned with all the subtlety and economy of the most modern art. It was an orchestral piece of French origin, purely instrumental, a symphonic prelude, achieved with an instrumentation relatively small for our time, yet with all the apparatus of modern technique and shrewdly calculated to set the spirit dreaming. Here's the dream Hans Castorp dreamed. He lay on his back in a sunny, flower-starred meadow, with his head on a little knoll, one leg drawn up, the other flung over, and those were goat's legs crossed over there before him. His fingers touched the stops of a little wooden pipe, which he played for the pure joy of it, his solitude on the meadow being complete. He held it to his lips, a reed pipe or little clarinet, and coaxed from it soothing head tones, one after the other, just as they came, and yet in a pleasing sequence. The carefree piping rose towards the deep blue sky, and beneath the sky, stretching the branching, wind-tossed boughs of single ash trees and birches whose leaves twinkled in the sun. But his feckless, daydreaming, half-melodious pipe was far from being the only voice in the solitude. The hum of insects in the sun-warmed air above the long grass, the sunshine, the soft wind, the swaying treetops, the twinkling leaves, all these gentle vibrations of the midsummery peace set themselves to his simple piping to give it a changeful, ever-surprising choice harmonic meaning. Sometimes the symphonic accompaniment would fade far off and be forgotten. Then goat-legged Hans would blow stoutly away, and by the naive monotony of his piping, lure back nature's subtly colorful, harmonious enchantment, until at length, after repeated intermission, she sweetly exceeded. More and higher instruments came in rapidly, one after another, until all the previously lacking richness and volume were reached and sustained in a single fugitive moment that yet held all eternity in its consummate bliss. The young faun was joyous in his summer meadow. So with that, let's welcome my dear students from UCLA who are going to treat us to the prelude of the Afternoon of the Faun. And this is Bigwo Singh and Alexander Tchaikov joining us now. So let's give them a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. While we're getting ready, I'll have the pleasure to introduce Samantha and Paul. Samantha Rose Hill is the author of the critically acclaimed 2021 book Hannah Arendt, and the editor and translator of What Remains, the collected poems of Hannah Arendt. She is associate faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research in New York, and her work has appeared in numerous publications, such as the Los Angeles Review of Books, LitHub, Open Democracy, and Contemporary Political Theory. And she's currently teaching a seminar on the Magic Mountain offered by the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. Last, but definitely not least, Paul Holdengräber was the founding executive director of Onassis Los Angeles, and prior to that, he was the founder and director of the New York Public Library's program Live, where he interviewed and hosted over 600 events, including interviews with Patti Smith, Slavoj Žižek, Jay-Z, and many more. Before his tenure at the library, he was the founder and director of the Institute for Art and Culture at LACMA. Paul holds a PhD in comparative literature from Princeton, and in 2010, the Austrian president has awarded him with the Austrian Cross of Honor for Science and Art. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Virginia Woolf was really so wrong. I mean, she wrote exquisitely about on being ill, but what she says is amazing and surprising. So in 1925, a year after Thomas Mann published The Magic Mountain, and in 1926, this essay was published separately in the Hogarth edition, and then again in 1930. But in 1925, this is what she wrote in an essay called On Being Ill. Considering how common illness is, how tremendous the spiritual change that it brings, how astonishing when the lights of health go down, the undiscovered countries that are then disclosed, what wastes and deserts of the soul a slight attack of influenza brings to view, what precipices and lawns sprinkled with bright flowers a little rise of temperature reveals, what ancient and obdurate oaks are uprooted in us by the act of sickness, how we go down into the pit of death and feel the waters of annihilation close above our heads and wake thinking to find ourselves in the presence of the angels and the harpers when we have a tooth out and come out to the surface in the dentist's armchair and confuse his rinse the mouse with the greeting of the deity stooping from the floor of heaven to welcome us. When we think of this, as we are so frequently forced to think of it, it becomes strange indeed that illness had not taken its place with love and battle, that jealousy among the prime themes of literature and novels one would have thought would have been devoted to influenza, epic poems to typhoid, odes to pneumonia, lyrics to the toothache. And then she says, but no. Well, she was wrong. We were fortunate to have Thomas Mann a year before write The Magic Mountain, published The Magic Mountain in 1924, a year before she wrote this essay, and republished it so she could have updated her point of view. This is not at all to criticize Virginia Woolf, but rather to, first of all, celebrate The Magic Mountain at 100 and wonder why we are celebrating it. Of course, we're celebrating it because it's the 100th anniversary. That's wonderful. Why not? But why The Magic Mountain now? And why, Samantha Rose Hill, have you decided to teach a class on The Magic Mountain now? People usually use the word relevant. Let's forget the word relevant. It seems, I think, from speaking a little bit to you, that this book is actually quite urgent in some ways.
We'll avoid timely as well as relevant,
Yeah,
I think.
unprecedented.
I'm not sure Virginia Woolf was wrong, actually. But 1924, 1925, I think there's the press of language in there and a sense of urgency in her attempt to reach for what can not so easily be expressed in everyday language, which is part of what Mann is, of course, doing as well in The Magic Mountain. Why The Magic Mountain now? I think, yes.
Yeah.
I initially taught The Magic Mountain actually last fall for the Brooklyn Institute, not as a course on its own, because I didn't think anyone would take a whole course on The Magic Mountain, but as a course under the guise of convalescence, and thinking about contemporary tellings of The Magic Mountain, like Deborah Levy's Hot Milk or Otussa Moshfegh's My Year of Rest and Relaxation, and what happens when the world goes into a kind of political stupor to be rudely awakened by the decline of democracy or the rise of fascism or a world war, because that feels all too relevant to me today. And so I was very pleased when a full class, I see many here tonight, signed up just to read The Magic Mountain with me. And I think part of the conversation that's been unfolding for us over the past 3 weeks in terms of relevance, in terms of timeliness, all those horrible words which don't mean much, I think has been about what it means to be awake to the world and what it means to step out of the ordinary routine of everyday life. And the desire to do that. Why do we have the desire to do that? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Well, that would be one reason to do it. But
the sanatorium set the way. It offered people a place to go away, apart from society, the society of men, to not so much cure tuberculosis, but to cure the conditions of modern life, which are unbearable for so many.
I think not everybody has done what Thomas Mann wanted good readers to do with The Magic Mountain. He wrote kind of an introduction to The Magic Mountain, thanking his American readers. In 1953, he published it. He gave it, I think, first as a lecture in Princeton, and then published a very interesting article about the making of I think it's called The Making of the Magic Mountain. And in it, he says that the good reader of The Magic Mountain reads The Magic Mountain twice. Now,
repetition.
Yeah, repetition.
Compulsion. Compulsion.
Now, I'm not exactly sure how many people here have read that twice. I won't ask you to read it.
We have hands.
There are a few people who have, but not everybody has. So I think some context might be interesting. And you know, I had occasion to read it for the second time in my own.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. In of all places, Lanai in Hawaii, which was, you know, yet another place quite removed from Davos, but its own little world. So it was quite interesting to read it away from the hustle bustle of daily life. But
not a lot of snow there.
Not a lot of snow there. Though, you know, it's interesting, right? Mann talks, I won't digress all evening, I promise, but Mann talks, though digression is the sunshine of narrative, but Mann talks about the mountains and the ocean being similar in some way.
Yes.
But maybe you can give a sense of The Magic Mountain, what it is about for you.
About or about for me? So I'll start with about.
About and then about for you.
So Thomas Mann was inspired to write The Magic Mountain in 1912 when he went to visit his wife, Katja, at the Wald Sanatorium in Davos. And he was given a diagnosis of consumption as well after a couple of weeks and invited to stay at the sanatorium. Mann declined, and he went back to the land below, where he discovered he did not, in fact, have tuberculosis. And he began to imagine what might have happened if he had decided to stay.
If he had been Hans Castorp.
If he had been Hans Castorp, yes. So the novel begins as Hans Castorp undertakes his journey up to the sanatorium in Davos to visit his cousin Joachim, who is suffering from tuberculosis, and he is going to stay with him for 3 weeks, and 3 weeks turn into 7 years. Certainly, it could not be long as that, Mann tells us.
And Mann says very interestingly in that introduction he gives to thanking the American reader in 1953, I could have stayed 3 weeks, I could have stayed 7 years, but instead I chose to go down and write The Magic Mountain,
Yes.
right?
Which ended up taking much longer than 7 years.
Yeah, you might say something about that whole period between 1912 when he starts and 1924 when he ends.
So Mann initially conceived of The Magic Mountain in 1912 as a comedic follow-up to Death in Venice. It was to be a very short piece, not 700 pages over 7 chapters. And that quickly changed in 1913. The kind of two philosophers, thinkers lurking in the background of The Magic Mountain that Mann was reading, 1913, 1914, that brought the novel into shape, were Friedrich Nietzsche and Goethe. And as my students, my very intelligent students have noticed, they're lurking on almost every page. In the time, Mann himself kind of undergoes a political transformation, which I think Beno was gesturing towards earlier. He goes from something of a conservative nationalist to a liberal Democrat, largely in response to World War I. And then, of course, the changing culture in Germany between the end of World War I and the rise of Hitlerism. And so the novel doesn't get its end, and yes, there will probably be spoilers tonight. If you haven't finished it, I'm sorry. It's difficult to talk about the novel without talking about the end because it's quite political. The end of the novel doesn't take shape until after World War I. And he kind of realizes what Hans Castorp's life is. I almost want to say for in the writing of it. Everything builds to those kind of pivotal 2 turning points. And then there was the sound of thunder. And then the final pages, where we've been on this journey for 7 years. And I, the first time I read it, I fell in love with Hans Castorp. And then this horrible, horrible narrator who I hate.
Let's give him a name. No.
So obtrusive. so meddling.
And cruel.
And well, that's the word I was going to. He's cruel. He's so cruel, and he turns almost like Michael Haneke. He turns the camera. He turns the novel back to the reader and says, There is our friend Hans Castorp, and now I'm going to make you watch him die.
Perhaps. Right.
Paul wants to hold out hope.
I
say embrace despair.
Whenever I hear the word hope, I always think of Kafka's great line, "There's hope, but not for us." But what's interesting also
there's laughter because there's nothing to laugh about. Adorno.
Yes, I know that line of Adorno, as Adorno famously said. No, and. I mean, so many things go through my head, but one of them is this notion that had Mann stayed,
Yes.
as Hans Castorp stayed. So in fact, Mann is putting Hans Castorp through what he himself didn't have to live with. Probably he would have become sick. And many of the inmates, one might say, of the sanatorium might be misdiagnosed. And I was thinking of this line, this think I very much love, named Ivan Illich. And Ivan Illich, in a book called Medical Nemesis, Expropriation of Health, which he wrote 50 years ago. So again, we could celebrate half a century of Ivan Illich's Medical Nemesis. He says the following, and I'd love you to comment on this in the context of the Magic Mountain. First line of Medical Nemesis is, the medical establishment has become a major threat to health.
It was, I was taken by the word inmate and the idea that Mann would have probably become sick. And it reminds me of the beginning of the Magic Mountain when Hans Castorp first meets the Dr. Behrens, and he says, "Oh, you're our new resident." And he says, no, I'm just visiting. Oh, just visiting. And he says, well, I'm perfectly healthy. I'm going to be an engineer. And the doctor looks at Hans and he says, oh, I've never met a perfectly healthy man before. I've never met a perfectly healthy man before. What does it mean to be perfectly healthy? What does it mean to be sick? I think this is one of the central questions that Mann is putting before us. And it's not just the medical industry, as Illich is pointing towards, I think, in that passage that you read, and I don't know the text, but for Mann, it's also our political society that is making us sick. I mean, certainly tuberculosis was a horrible disease. It was the leading cause of death in Europe and America at the turn of the century. Many people suffered greatly, and the people who were suffering greatly were people who were largely living in crowded city centers and working in industrial factories, and who were really subject to the conditions of the transformation of economy and society at that time. I think that the sanatorium is a fascinating institution in itself. So the first doctor to really undertake a study of tuberculosis was Dr. James Clark, who's an English doctor, and he was Keats's doctor. And Clark did not think that tuberculosis could be cured. He thought it was a secondary condition, and he thought that the cure for tuberculosis was a starvation diet, regular bloodletting, and to put people in a closed room without any fresh air. Sounds good, right? And then Dr. Boddington, another English doctor, came along and said that Clark has given up on humanity, that he is not interested in finding a cure, and he took it upon himself to undertake several case studies and got a house in the country and discovered that people who worked outdoors in the open air, like farmers, did not get tuberculosis. And so he would take suffering factory workers like the fork grinders in Sheffield to the country house. He would put them on a donkey and make them go riding in the country for several hours a day. And he fed them 5 or 6 meals, mostly of meat and milk, a really nourishing, fatty diet. And they got better. And then they got sick again when they had to go back to work. But that initial experiment became the foundation for the institution of the sanatorium. And the first sanatorium was in Silesia. And it had great success. And so the sanatorium became a very popular business industry.
Profitable.
very profitable industry in Europe. So I was at the two sanatorium in Davos for December, the Wald Sanatorium where Katja Mann stayed, and then the Schatzalp, which Mann mentions in the novel. And he would walk up there with Katja every day. It's on the top of a mountain. And the director of the Schatzalp took me into his office, and he had this nice poster on the wall, and he took the poster down, and then there was like a newspaper and a book, and he shoved it all aside, and there was this little wooden cabinet door. Didn't have a lock on it, and it was kind of safe. He opened it, and he pulled out the registers from 1900 through the 1930s, handwritten, of the profit margins.
I didn't know you were going there.
In 1904, it was making over $1 million in 1904, which is astronomical.
And it comes into in the novel.
Yes.
There's a lot of discussion about how much it costs.
Yes, you paid for a shower, you paid for toothpaste, you paid.
It was not
for
all inclusive.
It was not, well, by the time you paid your bill, it was, but no, it was not an all-inclusive resort. And the Schatzalp was the most expensive, luxurious sanatorium you could go to. Wilhelm Kaiser I had rented 3 floors just in case.
Never went.
And the new arrivals were in the archive in Davos. They have the old newspapers, and the new arrivals were announced in the newspaper every week on the society pages. And so each sanatorium had the names of the residents. And the longer you were at the sanatorium, the higher your name rose on the list. So it was also a place for gathering. Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer went there in 1933. You can see them walking on the promenade. And people would go and visit the very illustrious guests. That was a long response.
No. It brings to my mind many questions I have for tonight, and some I'll have another night. But for tonight, your own quest, your own pilgrimage, I want to call it that. You have spent the past years, really, the past couple of years, going from place to place to place in search of. And I was going to read a passage from the preface of Henry James Aspern Papers, but I'll just say it from memory, more or less. I know there's some English scholars here, so they will know that I'm misquoting. But basically, Henry James, in the preface to the Aspern paper, says, "I delight in a visitable, tangible, palpable past." And I feel that Samantha Rose Hill is on this journey to go back to this palpable past, the excitement you feel in telling us the story of what came out of that safe behind all the other tchotchkes that were in front of it is palpable to me. So I would like you to say something about that trip, about a certain door that got you so excited in the sanatorium, and about perhaps one other trip of your choice. I would personally like you to talk about Portbou, but you can choose any one you'd like.
Oh.
And what it is about, here we are, right? Here we are in the Thomas Mann house. And somehow that's significant. And perhaps it is. And we're not the first to come to visit this house. This house was visited by Susan Sontag and less known by Carlos Fuentes, who came as a young Mexican student at the age of 21 to be with Thomas Mann, and like Susan Sontag had nothing really to say to the great man. So I'm wondering, what is it for you that makes you go to these places?
This is an impossible question.
I like those.
Yes. Ich auch. I do too. I wanted to go to Davos to see the space, to see what inspired Mann, to get a sense of the place. And it was interesting between the two sanatoriums. The Wald sanatorium has been remodeled 3 times, but the Schatzalp has largely remained untouched. And so you really feel like you're stepping back into a different era. And there were people there wandering around with copies of the Magic Mountain, looking for the sets of the scenes. And I several days would go out the back door and start wandering up into the Alps and looking for the benches that Castorp sat on, and looking for the waterfall. And I got horribly lost looking for the waterfall as the snowstorm was coming on the top of this mountain. And you know, I'm thinking, I can't help, I know there's Davos and there is Port Beau and Walter Benjamin, who is dear to both of us, but you have another lady sitting there.
Jan Morris.
And to answer this question, I'm not sure I can do it without reaching for her understanding of how Trieste becomes a mirror, not just for a past time to return to, but the landscape becomes a way to encounter the self. And that's actually very much what Hans Castorp experiences when he goes up the Magic Mountain. He's able to step away from all of those social expectations and the press of ordinary time, which can be so crushing, to use Virginia Woolf's word. And he's able to finally gain a sense of himself. And
it's another voyage.
It's another voyage. And I think about that kind of nowhereness in an unknown place. And then I also, Walt Whitman is right there. And I think there's part of me that's always wondering where he's stopped. Where is he waiting? And there's something in that, in the multitudes of self that we're able to experience when we go travel the world. And I think because I'm a retired academic of sorts, and I live my life mostly in the library or sitting in archives, that this is my, this is my, I was avoiding the word home. But it is, and these are the thoughts and stories and places and people that I carry around in my head. And so when I need to leave the library, when I need to leave the archive, I go to spend time with them. And when I write about
spend time with them.
Yes.
So really,
I won't be coy.
no. But it's this wonderful writer who was a great biographer, Richard Holmes, in Footsteps and in other books, and in a wonderful Paris Review interview, talks about the biographer as haunted, as haunting, as looking for ghosts.
But this is, I shouldn't say this out loud, it's on tape, which is worse, but I was sitting in the library in the Bodleian last week working on a book I'm desperately trying to finish, and I leaned over to my best friend who was sitting next to me, and I was doing this interview about Hannah Arendt, and I just wanted to be writing my book, and I said to my friend, I wish Hannah Arendt would die so I could stop writing about her. And I said, I feel like I'm haunted. Oh, God. I'm haunted. And the ghost of Arendt is going to be stalking me for the rest of my life.
Indeed.
And I can't escape her. I can't escape. And so there are some days where I just want to be left alone by her. And so but I can't be, and it's true when you're a biographer, the subject that you take on very much becomes a lifelong relationship. And so you have to be committed in a way, and I have problems with commitment.
Richard Holmes talks about the biographer's role being like a call, it's like a handshake over time. Which I love that.
Yeah.
I just out of sheer pleasure for us both, I just want to read that passage from Jan Morris on Trieste and the meaning of nowhere, where she says, "I am not the first to associate the city with nowhereness," which fits perfectly with this idea of going to the Magic Mountain, leaving the responsibilities of daily life, of dailiness, and being, in a way, Hans Castorp, to quickly say something about it, Hans Castorp is given a chance by the doctor to go back, and he prefers not to. He really prefers to stay, one could say, incarcerated, or to stay in a surrounding that now has become familiar to him. And she says, "I'm not the first to associate the city with nowhereness. The Viennese playwright Hermann Bahr, arriving there in 1909, said he felt as though he was suspended in unreality, as if he were nowhere at all. Trieste is a highly subjective sort of place and often inspires such fancies. People who have never been there generally don't know where it is. Visitors tend to leave it puzzled, and when they get home, remember it with a vague sense of mystery, something that they can't put their finger on. Those who know it better often seem to see it figuratively, not just as a city, but as the idea of a city. And it appears to have a particular influence, and here are the great words. It seems to have a particular influence upon those of us with a weakness for allegory. That is to say, as the Austrian writer Robert Musil once put it, those of us who suppose everything to mean more than it has any honest claim to mean. So
I can't help but think of Walter Benjamin,
right,
who says that the only pleasure the melancholic permits himself is the pleasure of allegory. And there is something deeply, I think, melancholic about the Magic Mountain, and about these travels that I undertake. There is no honest claim, and of all the
so
places,
it's overdetermined in some way.
I don't experience it as overdetermined. I think there are maybe two things in there. One is that, when you walk down, I walk down the same street every day to go to the library, to sit in the same place, to write for 9 or 10 hours a day. And I am entirely in my head when I'm in that place, in that kind of thinking, self-reflective mode where I'm having many conversations, but they're contained within myself. And then when I go to do the research, when I go to Davos, when I go to Portbou to look for Walter Benjamin and see what's happened to Portbou, when I go to Naples or Ibiza, or I go to Paris looking for Rousseau, it's as though all the antennae come alive and my way of thinking changes. And for me, it's very much about the sensual perception and apperception of what's unfolding and how those landscapes affect my ability to think with those texts. It's as though this other part of my brain that I don't have access to turns on through the perception of the place where I am, where I have to be looking around constantly so I don't trip and fall because I don't know the sidewalk I'm walking down. And that does something to reason. And it's
reason.
To be in a heightened state, I think. I see Port Bow in my head right now.
Yeah.
But from you reading the Morse, actually, it's easy for me to recall Trieste in my head. And I went there to look for James Joyce and Rilke, to go to Duino, which is nearby. And it's one of these cities that is very much in between. And it's as though it's been almost frozen by time, or frozen in time.
Like a time capsule in some ways.
But it's not buried, and it's not in space. It's held in suspension. And I think that's somehow a bit different. And Port Bow, where Walter Benjamin tragically took his own life, has been turned into a Walter Benjamin tourist trap. They sell Walter Benjamin keychains in gift shops, and they have maps all around the town to walk the path. You can walk the path that Walter Benjamin walked from the train station to the house where he killed himself. And it's this... David said vulgar. It is the only economy of the town, though. And I can't help but think that Walter Benjamin would have found this hilarious.
Maybe.
But that's my conversation.
Yeah.
And it expands the conversation that I have with authors like Benjamin about reproducibility when I visit places like that.
A simple question is, after a trip like the one you took to Davos, how has that affected your reading for the fourth time, I believe, The Magic Mountain?
So I think I was hoping to cure myself. And
No such luck.
no, it's an illness.
What's the illness?
The compulsion. I read the end of The Magic Mountain this morning again, and I can't read it without.
And we will end the evening tonight by reading the end.
Paul's gonna make me cry in front of a room full of people. I can't read it without crying. I haven't cured myself. It affects the way that I read and teach the novel, because I can now answer interesting questions that the students ask me, and I can see the material details that Mann so meticulously cataloged in the novel. So it kind of fills out that landscape or that image. So when I was at the Wald Sanatorium, the director was showing me around, and when they remodeled it, they kept the glass door to the dining room, which still slams.
So you might say something about that, because we hear Madame Chauchat before we see her.
We hear her.
Yeah, and as we were discussing it a bit earlier, the novel is terribly boisterous.
It's so loud. It's a very loud novel, and Hans is constantly undone by all of these sounds, and so his heart pounding in his chest, the sound of the bad Russian couple engaged in illicit affairs on the other side of the altar.
Or maybe very illicit, but for Hans Castorp's ear,
Hans, bourgeois sensibility.
Yeah, he doesn't like what he hears.
Well, or maybe he likes it too much.
It inspires him, as we find out.
Well, yes, he needs his own object of affection, which is, of course, Claudia Chauchat. And he hears her before he sees her, and there's the sub-chapter is titled, "But of course, a female," who's slamming the door. She's this kind of reckless, as you said, boisterous figure, and she becomes the object that mediates his desire, because he's not quite sure what his desire is moving toward. And it's not even Madame Chauchat that he's so intrigued with, but what she reminds him of, which is a young boy from his youth who he had his erotic awakening with when he had to ask him to borrow a pencil. All too Freudian. And the shame is really right there, his temperature. And his laugh, we hear him laughing so much
I was about
when
to
he's undone by all of these little sounds.
I mean, laughter altogether, I mean, much has been written about laughter. A lot of it isn't quite humorous at all. But laughter is very present. The discomfort of laughter, the hilarity.
Yeah.
And I was curious about your thoughts about laughter in the book after reading what Thomas Mann wrote about the difference between irony and humor. Do you know that passage?
Remind me. Remind me.
So Thomas Mann, people talked about him as an ironist. Eric Heller wrote a whole book about Thomas Mann as an ironist. And Thomas Mann loves quoting Goethe. And so he says, irony, quoting Goethe said, is a grain of salt without which the food set before us couldn't be enjoyed. And Mann says, yes, maybe. And that's a good definition in a way of art. But he said, irony, for me, is that spirit in art which draws a smile from the reader or listener, an intellectual smile, I might call it, while humor induces a laughter that wells up from the heart. This, I personally rate higher as an effect of art. And how might that apply?
I love that.
Isn't it good?
It's so good.
I was so happy to
good.
find it. That was my little quest yesterday. And you know how I found it? By stealing a book from the library of Thomas Mann here. I brought it back. I mean, unlike Benjamin, who says the best way of
I'm not sure I would have brought it back.
I decided I wanted to work with Benno again. So
Don't let me in the library, Benno.
In any event, I was very happy to find that passage, but I'm wondering what it triggers and what it echoes for you in the world of the Magic Mountain.
Well, I mean, just to go back to the first question about the relevance today, we live in a time when irony is dead. It is nearly impossible to be ironic.
I mean, you have to go like this. Sort of this.
But that definition of humor is so beautiful, and the image is just of, when you hit the scene, the words, where it's reaching down into you and it's pulling something up that you have no control over. When Hans has these outbursts of laughter, he has no control over them. They have nothing to do with intellect or reason. They're tickling those parts of him. They're touching those parts of him that he is not even aware of. And at the beginning of the novel, they're constant because he doesn't know, he's not aware of anything going on inside of himself. And so every time he's unsettled by a sound, every time he looks at somebody... He has a
huge cough and...
A horrible cough. And even the taking of the temperature is humorous to him. That it should take 7 minutes to take. I mean, he's undone. He's undone. And I think that laughter in that Nietzschean sense is a way of revealing the self to the self, making you aware of something, although it's not always definable. And the laughter becomes less as the novel goes on, as he becomes more and more eloquent, as he is more comfortable expressing an opinion, as it's a kind of Bildungsroman, as he evolves, as he starts to cultivate himself, he starts laughing less humorously and actually starts employing a bit more irony.
I'm so interested by that beginning, and of course by that beginning and by that end. The beginning being him taking that journey to go and see his cousin and believing he's going on a little trip that, as you said, will last 3 weeks and no more. And he repeats that again and again and again. I'm here, I have just a few more days and I'm about to leave. But even before he steps out of the station in Davos, he says, I am a young man,
Yes.
Thomas Mann has him say, who is going on a journey where the one thing he doesn't want to do is change.
Yes.
Right? And this picaresque novel, I mean, it starts, in the train and he moves. And I think often of Calvino's great essay on Candide, where he says that Candide begins with a coup de pied au cul, with a hit in the butt, whatever you might say. And that's what happens here. And what we discover is that anything but. I mean, he changes dramatically. And I'm wondering how you understand that change and how you relate it also to the fact that Mann took such a long time to write the book.
And underwent many changes himself while he was writing it, as books can do to authors, I think. From the beginning, from those beautiful first pages, we have the narrator who,
who's there and
who's there, and he's telling us what is inside Hans's head, and he's telling us how, don't pay no attention to that. So he's playing this almost kind of magician role on the Magic Mountain. And so if you're told one thing, certainly it's going to be the other. Certainly it couldn't be as long as that. From the beginning, it's not going to be 3 weeks. It's going to be 7 years. We're told that he doesn't want to change. And then the narrator tells us he's going to die. And
there's a lot of foreshadowing.
There's immense foreshadowing. And yet we keep reading, we keep turning the pages, we keep following him on this journey. And the journey, I think, in itself, for Hans, is this slow coming into himself by bringing to the surface all of those things that bourgeois society, I'll just say, had pushed down in him, which Mann is holding up as a parallel of the European consciousness in the pre-war years. What is it that one is not aware of? And what is the relationship between love and death?
And what is the price you pay for not being aware?
For not being aware, for not paying attention to the daily newspapers.
A steep price. And so Mann, in publishing The Magic Mountain in 1924, is trying to tell us what fissure happened with the First World War, what broke, what the collapse might mean.
I think he's marking the turning point. He says, and the narrator tells us in the beginning that, so many things began with the First World War and they have not yet ceased. And part of what Mann captures so beautifully in this early modernist work is the turn away from the world of action, the world of politics, and that inward romantic turn, the kind of post-romantic turn inward to the self, which is a shift of consciousness, which very much has to do with communicable experience and what kinds of experiences that we feel like we can communicate in such a way as they are understood by the person listening to us. To go back to Wolf, trying to find a language for illness. One can describe pain, one can describe suffering, one can describe the sensation of a temperature, but there is no language in itself that can communicate to you what that might actually feel like. And so one is forced to depend upon metaphor. Metaphor from metaphorein, literally meaning to bridge over from that invisible realm of the mind to the world of appearances. And if we're forced to communicate our experience through metaphor, as Sontag so
Sontag
beautifully describes,
illness as metaphor.
We're constantly alienated from ourselves in a way. So there's always a kind of irreparable distance between us, which is very isolating. And I think Mann captures that sense of isolation, literally and metaphorically, beautifully.
And of individualism in some way.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Because one is contained within themselves.
Rereading this book, Samantha, it's quite a journey in and of itself. And I remain utterly surprised by just how many treatises there are in this book. And particularly when it comes to time. Time and again, Thomas Mann is trying to tell us, how can we talk about time? How can time be the subject of a novel? And I'm curious what your thoughts are about his way of trying to transmit to us what this very odd passage we all live through, the passage of time, is about.
Which is a metaphor in and of itself. I mean, so
because
Mann,
time may not be passing at all.
well, it doesn't exist. So Mann called it a Zeitroman, a time novel. And one of the things that was in the air in 1912 when he started writing it was the relatively new theory of general relativity, which Albert Einstein published in 1905, which radically changed the way that people perceived of space and time. So that time was what Einstein had observed was that time passes faster on the top of a mountain than at the bottom of a mountain. And so it is curved. And time depends upon the position of the subject to go to individualism. It's not universal. And there are whole passages in here. There's 2 pages where Mann is essentially copying out Einstein. In 1905, it's also worth noting that 2 other great pieces of Western literature were published. One is Sigmund Freud's 3 Theories on Sexuality, which gave birth to psychoanalysis, the unconsciousness, and the drive, which is also quite present, and Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism. Weber, who famously argued that the modern age is defined by disenchantment. And I think in Mann, we actually have a great counter-argument.
Trying to re-enchant.
Not to re-enchant, but to say, this is the enchantment. We do not live in a disenchanted world. That Weber was wrong. This is a fairy tale. This is a fairy tale. And what Castorp awakens to when the spell wears off is the price one pays for that enchantment of modernity.
So much more to talk about. That was quite that was a good fugue. But what I will end by is a little bit of Mann. I'm not to make you cry, but I think you get a sense of some of the complications of this novel. But I want to read that last page because it is so extraordinary. Sit back. This is the first time you get to sit back. Sit back and relax. And here, and I'm going to also...
My heart's pounding.
You can't...
I feel flushed.
This is very, very, very much... you could
I think
be...
I have a fever.
Yeah, I think these are exact lines from the book. So, and I will be quoting 2 lines from a poem that you will then hear. You will hear the music to it. Maybe David, before playing it, might say something so that it gives some musicological context, which I would not be capable of doing. Oh, how ashamed we feel in our shadowy security. We're leaving. We can't describe this, but our friend was hit too, with a question mark. For a moment he thought he was. A large clod of dirt struck his shin. It certainly hurt, but how silly, it was nothing. He gets up, he limps, he stumbles forward on the mud-laden feet, singing thoughtlessly, and all its branches rustled as if they called to me. And so, in the tumult, in the rain, in the dusk, he disappears from sight. Farewell, Hans Castorp, life's faithful child. Your story is over. We have told it to its end. It was neither short on diversion nor long on boredom. It was a hermetic story. We told it for its own sake, not yours, for you were a simple fellow. But it was your story at last, and since it happened to you, there surely must have been something to you. And we do not deny that in the course of telling it, we have taken a certain pedagogic liking to you. Might be tempted gently to dab the corner of an eye with one fingertip, and the thought that we shall neither see you nor hear from you in the future. Farewell, Hans, whether you live or stay where you are, your chances are not good. The wicked dance in which you are caught up will last many a sinful year, and we would not wager much that you will come out whole. To be honest, we're not really bothered about leaving the question open. Adventures in the flesh and spirit, which enhanced and heightened your ordinariness, allowed you to survive in the spirit what you probably will not survive in the flesh. There were moments when, as you played king, you saw the intimations of a dream of love rising out of death and this carnal body. And out of this worldwide festival of death, this ugly, rutting fever that inflames the rainy evening sky all round, will love someday rise up out of this too? Question mark. Thank you very much.
If I can first welcome back Andres Delgado, whom you've already heard sing so beautifully, and we'll have one more piece to play for you, which is Der Lindenbaum, from the same cycle from which the first two songs came. And it's that song, which, or the poem rather of that song, which Castorp is enamored so much with, and which Castorp is mindlessly singing as he trudges through the trenches in the First World War. And I think that Samantha and Paul touched on the themes of manipulation of time and love and death. And that's exactly what's happening in this song. Maybe it's worth reading the English text of the song. What do you think? Would you like to do that? That's wonderful. Yeah.
By the well before the gate stands a linden tree. In its shade I dreamt many a sweet dream. In its bark I carved many a word of love. In joy and sorrow I was ever drawn to it. Today, too, I had to walk past it at dead of night. Even in the darkness, I closed my eyes. And then its branches rustled as if they were calling to me. Come to me, friend. Here you will find rest. The cold wind blew straight into my face. My hat flew from my head. I did not turn back. Now I am many hours' journey from that place. Yet I still hear the rustling. There you will find rest.
Am Brunnen vor dem Tore, da steht ein Lindenbaum. Ich träumt in seinem Schatten, so Männchen süßen Traum. Ich schnitt in seine Rinde, so manches liebe Wort. Es zog in Freud und Leide zu ihm mich immer fort. Ich muss auch heute wandern, vorbei in tiefer Nacht. Da hab ich noch im Dunkel die Augen zugemacht und seine Zweige rauschen, als riefen sie mir zu. Komm her zu mir, Geselle, hier findest du meine Ruhe. Die kalten Winterbrise, mir grad in Tageslicht, der Hut noch mir vom Tor, wendete mich nicht. Nun bin ich manche Stunde entfernt von jenem Ort, und immer hör ich's rauschen, du fändest Ruhe dort. Nun bin ich manche Stunde entfernt von jenem Ort, und immer hör ich's rauschen, du fändest Ruhe